You're listening to the Valley Current.
Hey, Len, you look great.
So do you, and how are you doing?
Well, it's glorious weather here in Florida. I have to say, I finally understand what these snowbirds that come in from all over the country, they rent out the trailer homes. Like, these trailer homes are empty in most
When
of
I was in Florida, I heard some people say that the best thing that Florida can have is for a Floridian to leave Florida with a Canadian under each arm.
That's funny.
It's funny, but it's sad. But my weather here for the past few days and also today is as good, if not better, than yours.
Really?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Spectacular.
I'm impressed because I have heard that Silicon Valley has been cold this winter being like December, which just started. And then, of course, January and February and March don't necessarily improve all that much. And then April and May get really glorious, as does June and to some degree July. And then, of course, it gets hot in August and September. I mean, here, I have to tell you, the weather just is perfect. There's no humidity. I mean, very little humidity. And, the only thing bad I would say about being here in the winter is there is an influx of people that come from Minnesota and Montana. And Canada. And I'll tell you, they don't drive very well. So I almost got hit by a car this afternoon, and it literally threw me from my bike. And I thought, man, I hope I don't break my neck here as I was floating in the air. And, it was like, this is the first time I've had a bike accident. I mean, he didn't actually hit me. He came close. Might have been a she. They, of course, didn't stop. And I just, I got thrown on the concrete and was bleeding for a while. And of course, no one actually stops. They just they're like, you're going to get up or you're not going to get up. There's so much roadkill on the road. You see deer and boar and all sorts of roadkill, birds. And I thought to myself, man, I hope I'm able to get up. Then the second thing I thought is, I hope the bike works, because I was like 15 miles from my house. It wouldn't have been easy walking that bike back, but luckily the bike worked, and I was able to get back.
Happen?
Oh, like about 4 hours ago.
Really?
Yeah, about 4 hours ago. Yeah, it was funny because I'm such a really good bike rider. I think I am, at least. Like, I can maneuver, I can do a lot of stuff. But man, if you have someone that's in their late stage and they're driving a car, I think somewhat recklessly. And, I think unfortunately, that's a lot of the Florida population. The one big difference in Florida is the car insurance is about twice the price of California. So in California, for exactly the same car, I paid half the price. And I asked the guy, what changed? He says, well, you're in a more dangerous state so far as car accidents are concerned. Of course, every other billboard is a lawyer that's seeking plaintiffs for car accidents. Every other billboard, like literally every single other billboard. Of course, then there's all the rest of the junk that you see up there. So it's Florida this time of year can be a little tricky to maneuver, because it definitely does get an inflow of people that are coming in, mostly retired people. And they live in these little sheds, really, these trailer parks that go abandoned about 6 months out of the year. There's 6-7 months out of the year, there's no one there. Starting, say, in about, I don't know, April or May, there'll be no one in these trailer parks for May, June, July, August, September, October.
I know. I lived there for 2 years or 3 years, and I experienced all of what you are describing.
Right. I mean, the weather is really glorious here for anyone that is not a skier. I mean, if you're a skier, you love being in the cold weather. You love the precipitation generating the snow, and you're out there with your skis and it's the winter is sort of look forward to. But if you're not skiing anymore, I don't know that you really want this cold weather as you get older in particular. I think it's just not where you want to be. And the heating bills, of course, are pretty high, right? If you look at the heating bills, these people in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Montana and North Dakota and South Dakota, I mean, it gets pretty cold. You were mentioning some controversy that you have with the way in which things get presented. And I thought we can make a topic out of that because you sent an email that said this is another example of the way in which people misinterpret things. And I thought it would be helpful.
It's not really a misinterpretation. It's a failure to realize the obvious.
What's that? What's the obvious?
The obvious is that now I think we have over 200 people who have contracted this new mutation.
Right. They call it a variant to sugarcoat it, but mutation is the right word, isn't it?
Of course.
Right.
And so there are about 200, I think there are even more than that from what I heard today. But then they all say, well, we'll find out whether this mutation is protected by the present vaccines.
Right.
Well, they don't have to wait 2 weeks. They only have to wait long enough to go to a patient and ask them whether they have had the vaccine and which one and when.
Right. Simple question.
There is no report that I have seen anywhere where that logic has been stated by anyone else on the planet except me.
Well, maybe they're saying people won't tell the truth about their truth.
I doubt that in 200 people, you're going to find 100 who are going to lie.
Right.
And even if they do lie,
right,
you ask them for their certificate of vaccination if they say they were vaccinated.
Right.
If they can't produce one, then they weren't vaccinated. So how do they lie easily?
Right.
And we could then have a preliminary answer as of 2 weeks ago, when this mutant first arrived, to this critical question of efficacy of the present vaccines to that mutation.
Right.
It's just impossible to believe that the virologists and epidemiologists out there are so stupid as to not realize what I've just described.
Yeah, maybe it's such a crazy world that people think somehow you're violating the privacy of someone by simply asking them a question, which I think is a pretty ridiculous position.
Well, I can't understand why that would be true, because people have a vaccination card.
Right.
You don't have to lie. You don't have to worry about giving private information, because when you're asked for the card by a qualified questioner,
right,
produce it. It's nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah, that card is actually becoming more and more relevant. I travel with it.
Sure.
My wallet, because if you go into, like we went into the symphony has reassembled here in Tampa. First time we've heard live music in nearly 2 years. And they said, well, we want to see your vaccination card or proof that you've been recently tested. And of course, we had the vaccination card, and they looked like they were doing that with everyone. And of course, people were complying.
This mystery is inexplicable.
Right.
I don't understand why Tony and his associates, some of whom I know Tony, have not thought of this.
No, they must have thought of it. I think there's something else going on. You may want to lob an email over to Tony Fauci. You're on a first-name basis.
He's too busy. I wouldn't bother.
You wouldn't bother. You might save the world. You might save the world by bothering him,
Well, my suggestion is so obvious. I cannot believe that I'm the only one on the planet who thought of it. That's impossible.
Right. It sounded as though they thought it was only a handful of people. But your point is it's such an easy interrogatory to ask for any number, take a random sample of 200 people, that could probably be as few as 20, and just say, well, have you been vaccinated? And if the answer from most are yes, then you got your answer, right?
Yes, it's a preliminary answer because clearly it's a small number and you can't be definite about it, but at least it'll give you some preliminary insight. And by now I think they're up to the thousands now in Europe and South Africa and not in this country. There are only 3 apparently. But you have several thousand to query and nobody's doing it. And if they are, they're keeping it a secret.
Right. Yeah, I wonder what's going on because even the press hasn't really picked up on this point, right?
Exactly. Right? You would think that the talking heads on TV and in radio would also have some people there with common sense who should be asking this question.
Right. Yeah, I don't get it. I agree. And it's like a letter to the editor that you wonder how people will react to, right?
Yes, and the other thing that really aggravates me is for many of the statistical and comparison studies that you see done on TV or maybe on radio as well, compare issues, for example, they compare the pandemic today with the one in 1918, but missing from all of those studies is a fact, a statistical fact that is totally ignored. And that is the increase in population. During my lifetime alone, the population of the United States has more than doubled. And that point, if included in some of the statistical studies that result in amazement, would not be amazing. There are just more people who have succumbed to whatever the study is about or any other conclusion. The conclusion must include an increase in the population.
Right.
Rarely done. I've rarely seen it done.
Right. So you have to wonder, is there something bigger going on here? Is there some desired amplification?
I think it's stupidity. It's nothing more simple than that. It's how to lie with statistics. You know that story.
Well, but what's the motive, right?
There's no motive. It's just stupid. Failure to understand. It's not necessarily a evil motive, although certainly that's possible. But I doubt that it's a conspiracy.
Well, let me tell you, I had a call yesterday, and I'll leave the particular activist's name out because I think he's very public, but I don't want to embarrass him. I hope to have him on a podcast. And he is a Chinese national. He moved to Hong Kong. He's now become an activist in Hong Kong. And his view as an activist against the Chinese government, essentially the Communist Party, the ruling party, is that they are controlling the U.S. press. He's actually taken the view that a lot of what gets spun in the U.S. press is highly influenced by China, and that China is essentially a nation that has a lot of influence on the U.S., including the U.S. press, far more influence than any other country. And so his view is you really can't trust the popular press at all. You really can't trust what gets spun out of even basic great newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal. Those are the 4 that I read on a regular basis. And of course, they all do spin stories slightly different ways, and I pay attention to that. But his view in the discussion I had with him by phone was, China is doing a lot of things that are sort of not captured by the U.S. press, and I also read the China Daily that does come out of China and is published here in the U.S. And his view is all that stuff is highly influenced by the party leadership, and they basically are very wealthy and they can do a lot of things. So that's why I ask, in a way, to what end is this lack of scientific approach not being taken? Because you're just saying, look, this is just basic, critical inquiry, right?
Yes, well, I've heard that story about the influence that China has had and may still have on some segments of information in this country. But the fact that that can occur, it has been substantiated to an enormous extent when the Russians influenced the 2016 election. They were on the side of Trump, and we all have heard the stories and read the stories about how they influence populations in this country who are easily influenced. That's no secret. That's all been discussed. It's been investigated. So I don't find it to be impossible. I believe that there are sources in which we should have confidence. One of the major problems with the New York Times is their clear and obvious and years-long bias against Israel. That has been documented every way possible, to the extent that an organization called CAMRA, that you may or may not have heard of, it stands for the Committee for Something Middle East Reporting. They're a unique organization that employs people who can speak virtually every language in the Middle East and in Russia, like no other organization. And they publish English translation of Middle East newspapers in Arabic and in Pakistan and all these obscure languages.
Right.
And Farsi. And the New York Times, almost every day, not only the New York Times, but the Guardian is also another example of enormous bias against Israel and publishing stories by people who know nothing about which they're writing. And I could send you dozens and dozens of examples. CAMRA has gone to the extent of paying for billboards that are several stories high on the exterior walls of a building that faces the New York Times editorial offices in an effort to tell them where the reports by some of their people about what's going on in Israel are false. Absolutely false. It's absolutely amazing. Terrorist organizations have influenced the New York Times and the Guardian to believe outrageous things about Israel that are completely non-existent.
So, this is part of the problem that exists currently and upon which Trump obviously leveraged this idea that there's a lot of fiction, he called it fake news or reporting, that doesn't really give a reliable picture of what's really going on.
Correct.
And that's why I asked, to go back to the main question, we have a lot of smart people in this world. You're one of the top 1%, but you're not alone. There's probably at least 100 other people of equal intelligence to you. And you would probably even agree that Fauci may well be one of them. And it would be just simple deduction to say, hey, we've got a couple of hundred people. Let's at least sample and ask some basic questions here and find out whether they were or weren't. My guess is the answer is going to come back that they were inoculated and they still got the variant. That's my guess. I'm guessing that's your guess.
Well, you're right, because 3 or 4 who have had this new mutation have told the media who have reported it that they were vaccinated.
Right.
And apparently the pathology that they have had has been mild, very mild. I don't think there's any report of anyone dying of this mutation.
Right. So the real question is, what's the end game here? Is it sort of along the lines of we want to defer, we're too afraid to sort of report anything for a while, so we have to turn this into a PhD dissertation? Is that sort of the bigger picture? Everyone's in fear of, doing conjectures and refutations. That's really what we're talking about, basic scientific inquiry, as Professor Popper would put it, Karl Popper, right? You're conjecturing something that needs to either be refuted or not refuted, right?
Well, I think the broad outcome, what I suggested in one of our first broadcasts, podcast, has come true and will come true. And that is that this COVID-19 group of viruses will act very much like influenza, which is part of the group.
Right.
And it will require an annual vaccination.
Right.
Pfizer and Moderna are now working on vaccines that include the RNA sequences that are found on the new spike structures of these new mutations.
Right.
In an effort to produce vaccines against these new mutations. Well, that's exactly what we do every year.
Right.
With the flu. It's no different.
Right. And people still get the flu, as we know, and we know it's kind of a bit of a hit or miss, right? I mean, there's no guarantee.
Yes, well, that's the same problem that will probably occur with these COVID viruses. That is, because it's going to take less time to make these annual coronavirus vaccines, because the technology is much faster than that used to produce the flu vaccine, which is, those vaccines are made in embryonated eggs.
Right.
And the present ones, the COVID group, are made in essentially in the laboratory, of course, by manipulating the RNA sequences. And so we'll have the vaccines faster. But even if you could make a vaccine in the millions of doses in a couple of months, during those couple of months, you can get other variants arising, and that's exactly what happens with the flu. That's why the flu vaccines are never 90% effective.
Right. Right.
You're lucky if they're 50% effective.
Right. So do you do the annual thing? Because I do it, and I always wonder whether I'm wasting my time doing it. Do you do it?
You mean a flu vaccine?
Yeah, the typical standard flu vaccine.
I've never taken a flu vaccine. Never.
Interesting. Why not?
Well, it's certainly in the past 20, well, I wouldn't say 20, in the past 10 years or 8 years, my contact with the public has been minimal.
Right.
And I think has played a large part in my not getting the flu. And I attribute that partly to my post nasal drip problem.
Oh, that's a benefit.
Oh, yes, because my nasopharyngeal area is constantly washed with mucus.
Right. And
the purpose of the mucus is to trap microorganisms, which it does very effectively, and doesn't allow them to replicate easily in that mucosal network.
Right.
The other thing that I've done on occasion, and there has been no study to prove that it works or doesn't, but it has worked for me only in the sense that nothing happened. And that is many, many years ago, when I did get colds, I would frequently gargle at first sign of a cold. That is the first sign of a tickling in my throat. I would gargle with vodka.
Vodka?
vodka or
Vodka?
yeah,
Wow.
or something that has a very high concentration of alcohol, because those viruses are inactivated by alcohol. So if you gargle with vodka, or even better, what is it called? There's Southern Comfort.
Southern Comfort. I've never heard this. I've never heard this before.
Oh, it works. I think it works for me. You gargle with Southern Comfort, which is an alcohol content of about, I don't know, 40 or 50%. I think it's huge, but you can easily get that data. I forget some of the numbers now. But gargling with Southern Comfort, which is a high alcohol content,
Right.
will kill whatever it comes in contact with in the back of your throat.
Wow.
You don't have to drink it, you just gargle with it.
So let me give you a lot of credit for something that you don't know, but my mom complained in her final days of having postnasal drip. And I told her the story you just said about how that's a good thing and was actually protecting her. And when she reframed that, and it was only the last 3 or 4 months of her life, she was like, oh, okay, I'm not annoyed. Like her brain wired. Yeah, Len, I have to give you a lot of credit because I told this exact story to her. I said, a really smart PhD, you should meet him someday, Dr. Leonard Hayflick, has exactly what you have, Mom, and he actually applauds it. It may be a pain in the ass, but the truth is it's actually protective. And she would tell all the doctors and nurses that came by that now she's no bothered anymore by it, because now she feels like she's been blessed to have gotten it, because I guess at a certain age, maybe in your case.
Well, in her later years, when she had this drip, apparently, were her common colds reduced?
Yeah, I don't remember her ever getting like a really bad flu.
Did she ever have flu during those years?
Right. I don't remember that.
Well, I'm sure you would if she was troubled by them such that she would tell her children. So I would say that's, anecdotal, but has some significance.
Right. Right. I mean, I do think it's proof that sometimes when you rethink what you may think is sort of an annoyance and realize that it might be a blessing in disguise, it actually enables you to kind of put up with whatever that annoyance is, because it may turn out to be a blessing, right?
That's right.
Right.
That's one of the reasons I opted to go to a Thanksgiving dinner with 3 of my children and their families in Mountain View last week, because I had that going for me. And of course I had my vaccination and my mask and my face mask, which very few people other than those who work in hospitals wear.
Right.
I also brought with me my UV lamp, which I had on in my hotel room at night when I was sleeping.
Right.
And so far, so good.
So it's an interesting question, because in many ways you're sort of indirectly suggesting that you could focus on a lot of things in even this collection of 200 people in terms of slicing and dicing the data, because obviously some may have had 1 inoculation, the Brits call it a jab. Some may have 2, some may have 3, some may be, otherwise resistant based on this postnasal drip stuff and other factors. Like, you can make a little study here that would be quite interesting, wouldn't it?
Yeah, you could also do an even more important thing, which I hope they're doing. I haven't heard anything about it, and that is to take a small blood sample, a couple mils of blood,
right,
to determine the neutralization level to that mutant and other strains of COVID viruses. That's easily done in the lab now. The technology is simple.
Yeah, it's really an interesting question. The more I think about your pointed question of why isn't this sort of a critical headline in any of these newspapers, you have to wonder, are we just totally asleep at the wheel? Because I don't buy that view. So then you have to wonder, where do you go from, no, you're not asleep at the wheel, there is a reason. Okay, what can that reason possibly be? Other than they're too worried about saying anything until somehow they've collected all the data, right?
You've got all of these professors of epidemiology and virology being interviewed daily until it gets to be boring as hell. And none of them have come up with this question, this observation.
Right.
None of them.
Right.
Is it a conspiracy? No, I don't believe it's a conspiracy. I don't know what it is.
Right. That's my question. Like, if we want to do some conjecturing, we can go down the path of the phone call yesterday and say, well, the Chinese have forced suppression. Like, that's one theory.
Why would they? What's the gain for them to do that?
Well, some view that, they're getting sued. There's like about 50 different federal cases. Most of them are kind of, a little off the wall, but there are a few that actually look like they might actually get to next stages, where recourse against China's assets in the U.S. is being sought for trillions of dollars. I mean, we haven't put a round number on what the last, 18 to what might soon be 24 months. Remember, this thing actually started in November or December of 2 years ago, right? We're going on the second year anniversary of when this thing actually started.
Well, that's COVID-19. That's not the mutant.
Well, that's right. But then there's what might be called the fruit of the poisonous tree idea in the law, which is if something gets started and then it mutates, the person who started it has to carry all the culpability or blameworthiness for all the consequences. So, the example that's out there is you injure someone and then they get taken to the hospital and the ambulance gets into an accident. You actually get tagged for the additional damages for the ambulance getting into an accident, because it's like, hey, that's a natural consequence of the accident you caused. I mean, there can be exceptions to that sort of situation, like if the ambulance driver is a drunk driver or something like that. But generally speaking, the tortfeasor, the defendant, has to accept all the consequences of their original tort. So if you say the original tort here was, this is what some people think, that Chinese.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this episode of The Valley Current.